Over the past few years, Germany has undertaken one of the most significant shifts in its post-World War II defense policy, a transformation that amounts to a massive military rebuild. After decades of prioritizing a relatively modest, professional force and relying heavily on allies, such as the United States, for collective defense, Berlin is now racing to augment its armed forces' size, capabilities, and readiness in response to a security environment that German leaders and NATO officials see as increasingly unstable. This transformation traces directly to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, an event that shattered the illusion of a stable European security order, and made clear to many policymakers in Berlin that Germany could no longer depend on others to guarantee its defense. As part of this defense overhaul, Germany's government under Chancellor Friedrich Merz has committed to one of the largest recent increases in military spending in the country's history. The defense budget for 2026 stands at an unprecedented level, with estimates suggesting it could reach around €83 billion, a figure that dwarfs previous annual allocations and reflects a determination to invest in heavy weapons, modern equipment, and expanded personnel. This build-up is not solely about acquiring hardware. It is equally about addressing chronic manpower shortages in the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, which years of running a volunteer-only recruitment model have left lightly staffed compared with the demands of both NATO and Germany's newly ambitious defense goals. Part of the debate surrounding this military expansion has centered on the question of conscription. After suspending compulsory military service in 2011, Germany has since relied on voluntary enlistment to fill the ranks of its armed forces. However, voluntary recruitment has repeatedly fallen short of what the Bundeswehr needs to meet NATO capability targets. Faced with the prospect of needing tens of thousands of additional soldiers to bolster frontline units, increase reserves, and support alliance missions, government officials, defense planners, and lawmakers began considering various ways to ensure that sufficient personnel would be available should tensions escalate. In 2025, the German government negotiated and passed new legislation designed to overhaul the country's military service system. This reform, often referred to in official circles as the Military Service Modernization Act, represents a compromise between a purely volunteer force and the full reinstatement of mandatory conscription. Under the new system, which entered into force on January 1, 2026, all 18-year-old citizens, male by legal definition, and those assigned male at birth whose legal gender is male, are now legally required to fill out a detailed questionnaire assessing their physical condition, educational background, and their willingness to serve in the armed forces. Women can participate in the questionnaire and subsequent processes voluntarily, but only men are obligated to complete the paperwork. From mid-2027 onward, these young men will also undergo mandatory medical examinations. This requirement does not automatically thrust them into service, but it creates a comprehensive pool of eligible individuals from which the defense establishment can draw if necessary. Bundesregierung +1. The legislation also includes provisions empowering the Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, to enact compulsory service if voluntary recruitment falls short of meeting specified targets. In other words, the initial phase emphasizes voluntary enlistment, improved incentives, and a streamlined process for recruiting young adults into the Bundeswehr, but it reserves the option of a draft as a backup mechanism. This conscription on demand approach is intended to balance the need for greater military manpower with lingering public sensitivity about returning to compulsory service after a long hiatus. Public reaction to this reform has been highly polarized. Thousands of people, particularly younger Germans, have taken to the streets in cities like Berlin to protest against what they interpret as a creeping return to mandatory military service. Critics argue that the new law, despite technically maintaining a volunteer system, effectively creates the infrastructure for a draft and demands too much from young citizens without adequately addressing broader social concerns. In multiple demonstrations across Germany, tens of thousands have voiced opposition to the law, with nationwide protests involving students and civil society groups decrying what they see as unnecessary militarization in the absence of direct threat, and calling for investment in education, healthcare, and other public services rather than defense. Al Jazeera +1. Supporters of the reform, including many within Chancellor Merz's Conservative Christian Democratic Union and in the Social Democratic Party coalition partner, argue that the measure is a necessary response to shifting geopolitical realities. They point to pressure from alliance partners to share the burden of collective defense and to contribute significantly more to NATO's readiness goals. Analysts note that Germany's position, at the heart of European logistics and military operations, means its military must be robust and capable, not merely symbolic. Some defense commentators also highlight that European nations are collectively setting aside hundreds of billions of euros for new weapons and defense infrastructure, a trend that would be undermined if Germany, the region's largest economy, were to lag in personnel and capability. Bloomberg.com. The Bundeswehr itself has struggled with personnel numbers for years. Prior to the reforms, active duty strength hovered around 180,000 soldiers, a figure insufficient to sustain Germany's own defense needs and its expected contributions to alliance missions. By contrast, NATO capability targets an internal German defense planning envision a force of at least 260,000 active duty soldiers by the early 2030s, along with a large reserve component numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Achieving these figures will require significant growth in recruitment, training, retention, and logistical support, as well as cultural shifts within German society regarding service and national defense. Anadolu Ajansi +1. Under the new military service framework, recruits receive competitive pay and benefits intended to make military service more attractive. Initial terms of service range from 6 to 11 months, with monthly remuneration that compares favorably with civilian entry-level wages, in some cases exceeding €2,600 before tax, and additional incentives such as subsidies for driving licenses and access to vocational training for those who extend their service beyond the minimum. The government hopes that these financial and professional benefits will lure a steady stream of volunteers, especially young adults considering their career prospects. However, whether these incentives will be enough to meet ambitious recruitment goals remains an open question for policymakers. Germanpolicy.com/news.net. The broader context for Germany's military expansion and conscription debate is the rapidly evolving security landscape in Europe. Russian military modernization and repeated threats against NATO member states have fueled anxiety in capitals across the continent. Germany has taken part in high-profile, joint military exercises and is updating logistical and civil defense strategies to ensure readiness for a range of scenarios, from conventional invasions to hybrid warfare involving cyberattacks and sabotage. Top Bundeswehr commanders have publicly argued that a strong and well-staffed military not only deters potential aggression, but also helps reassure international partners of Germany's commitment to collective defense. The Times. Despite these arguments, the return of conscription in any form remains controversial within Germany. Many citizens remain deeply skeptical of military service, a legacy of the country's historical experiences in the 20th century and its post-war pacifist orientation. Surveys suggest that while a majority of Germans might support voluntary service, a much smaller portion are comfortable with a return to a full draft, especially if it affects large numbers of 18-year-olds. This cultural divide complicates political efforts to rapidly expand the Bundeswehr. Lawmakers find themselves balancing domestic political pressures against strategic imperatives. Wikipedia. During parliamentary debates, some members of the governing coalition have expressed concern that the new law does not go far enough, arguing for automatic triggers to convert the system into compulsory conscription, without needing a separate legislative vote. Others caution that such automaticity could exacerbate opposition and undermine broader public support for defense initiatives. For now, the law's compromise model, voluntary service first, conscription if needed, remains in place, reflecting the ongoing tension between Germany's strategic needs and its democratic politics. Global Post. As Germany enters 2026 with this new military service framework in effect, the coming years will be crucial in determining whether the country can meet its ambitious defense targets. The success of voluntary recruitment efforts will be closely watched, not only by German policymakers, but also by NATO allies who rely on Berlin's contributions to collective security. If voluntary enlistment proves insufficient, the political debate over compulsory service is likely to intensify, with profound implications for German society and its role on the world stage. At the same time, the expanded defense spending and institutional reforms signal a decisive shift in Germany's strategic posture, an acknowledgement that the age of relatively complacent defense policy is over and that a more robust and resilient military will be essential in an era of heightened geopolitical competition. In sum, Germany's military rebuild represents a dramatic reorientation of national policy driven by external threats, alliance expectations, and internal debates about duty, security, and national identity. The tentative steps toward reintroducing a form of conscription reflect both practical manpower needs and deep-seated political and cultural divisions, and the outcome of this experiment will be watched closely across Europe and beyond.